Imagine losing everything in the blink of an eye: your identity, your wealth, your life. That's exactly what happened to Alexander Stone, a billionaire who woke up after a tragic accident, with no memory of who he was. But there was one person by his side, a woman who claimed to be his wife. The catch? She was poor, and he had no recollection of her at all. How could this woman be his wife? What was she hiding? Stick around, because this story will unravel a truth so shocking, it will change everything you thought you knew about love and fate. Welcome to a world of untold stories and shocking truths. Some secrets change lives forever, and this one just might. Let's begin. The blinding lights flickered as Alexander Stone slowly regained consciousness. His head throbbed painfully, and his vision was blurry, as if his mind was struggling to make sense of the world around him. He tried to move his hands, but they felt heavy, as if they were weighed down by something invisible. Panic began to surge through him, but before he could even process what was happening, a soothing voice broke through the haze. "Alex, you're awake. Thank God." He blinked, attempting to focus on the voice. Standing at his side was a woman, her face full of worry but with a faint trace of relief in her eyes. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to recall her name, but nothing came to him. She seemed familiar, but there was a strange distance between them, a gap that couldn't be bridged. Who was she? He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry. His lips cracked as he forced out the words. "Who are you?" Her eyes widened, a flash of hurt flickering across her face, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "It's me, Emma, your wife." His heart skipped a beat. Wife? He didn't remember having a wife. In fact, the very idea seemed absurd. Alexander Stone, the heir to one of the most successful tech empires in the country, married to this woman? His mind scrambled for answers, but there was only a blank space where the memory of their life together should be. Emma's smile faltered, and she gently took his hand. "You don't remember, do you?" she whispered, her voice soft but filled with sadness. "It's okay. I know this is hard for you right now, but we've been through so much together." He glanced at her, his mind racing. This woman Emma was clearly not from his world. He'd spent his life surrounded by the elite, mingling with the country's wealthiest people. But Emma, she didn't fit into that world. Her clothes were simple, faded jeans and a plain sweater. Nothing like the high-end designer suits his former colleagues would wear. Her face was kind, but there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of struggles he couldn't fathom. She didn't belong in his world, and yet she claimed to be his wife. "I don't—" Alexander's voice trailed off. He was still trying to make sense of what was happening. How could he have forgotten everything? His empire, his lavish lifestyle, his friends, his family. Everything felt like a distant memory, something out of reach. But this woman, she was here. She was real. "Look," Emma said, squeezing his hand. "You were in a car accident. You hit your head pretty badly. The doctors said you have amnesia. But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Alex. We're in this together, okay?" Her words were meant to comfort him, but they only left him feeling more confused. He searched her eyes, looking for some kind of clue, some indication that she wasn't telling him the truth. But all he found was sincerity, and it made his head spin. "Amnesia," Alexander muttered, still trying to process the weight of it all. "I don't remember anything." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, but we'll take it one day at a time. I'll help you remember everything. I'll be right here." It was too much to take in all at once. He had so many questions, so many doubts. He had always been in control, always known the answers. But now, nothing made sense. His mind was a jumbled mess of fragments, with no clear direction. I don't understand," he whispered. "How could you be my wife? You're not like the women I know." Emma's face darkened again. "What do you mean by that, Alex?" she asked, her voice edged with frustration. Before he could respond, the door opened again, and the man reappeared, his eyes flickering between them. Emma looked at him with a guarded expression. I'm going to give you some time alone with him, the man said before walking out. The door closed softly behind the man, leaving Alexander and Emma alone. The silence in the room was thick, and Alexander's mind was racing. His thoughts were like a storm, chaotic, unsteady, and he didn't know how to begin making sense of it all. His world had shifted in the blink of an eye, and now everything was unfamiliar. Emma sat by his side, her hand still gripping his, though her expression was carefully neutral. "Who was that man?" Alexander asked, finally breaking the silence. His voice felt strange, as if it didn't belong to him. "That was Stephen," Emma replied, her voice soft, though there was an undeniable tension beneath the calm exterior. He's a business partner, someone from your past." Alexander frowned. "Business partner? What kind of business?" Emma hesitated, then gently pulled her hand back, as if to give him space. "It's complicated, Alex. You've been through a lot. Let's just focus on you getting better for now." Her answer was vague, evasive even. Something about it didn't sit right with Alexander. Why was she avoiding specifics? And why had the man seemed so distant? Alexander's instincts were on high alert, and for the first time since waking up, he felt a deep sense of unease. "Complicated?" he repeated, his gaze narrowing. "What exactly is so complicated?" Emma shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away. "I'll explain everything when you're ready, I promise," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right now, you need rest. You need time to heal." Alexander's frustration flared. The pieces weren't adding up. The more he tried to understand, the less he felt like he was getting the full picture. He had been told that he was in an accident. He had lost his memory. But what if there was more to this than just amnesia? What if there was something or someone that Emma wasn't telling him about? He leaned forward in the bed, his mind whirling. "I want to know everything, Emma. I need to know. This doesn't feel right." Emma flinched at the urgency in his voice, but nodded slowly. "All right. But you have to understand, it's not easy for me either. It's been so hard, Alex. I've had to watch you forget everything, even me." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat back against the pillow, lost in thought. Suddenly, a knock at the door interrupted the moment, and before either of them could respond, it opened. A nurse stepped inside, her face professional but warm. "Mr. Stone," she said, her gaze flicking from Alexander to Emma. "We need to take you for some tests, doctor's orders." Alexander nodded, still feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He stood cautiously, feeling his legs wobble beneath him as he tried to find his footing. The nurse stepped forward to assist him, but Emma was already there, moving swiftly to support him. "I'll come with you," she insisted, her hand resting on his arm. The nurse hesitated, but ultimately nodded. "All right, we'll get you settled into a wheelchair, Mr. Stone. Just a few tests, then you can rest." As they wheeled him down the sterile white hallways of the hospital, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The walls seemed too bright, the air too still, and every step he took felt like it was pulling him further away from the answers he so desperately sought. He glanced at Emma, her face a mixture of concern and something else he couldn't quite place. Was it guilt, or perhaps fear? He wasn't sure, but whatever it was, it made him more determined to find the truth. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, "I don't understand. Why do I feel like I don't belong here? In this place? In this life?" Her gaze shifted to him, her lips parting as if she were about to speak, but the words never came. Instead, she looked away, staring at the floor. They arrived at a small examination room, and Alexander was helped into a chair. The nurse began attaching wires to his chest, preparing him for the tests. The entire time, Emma remained standing at his side, her presence a silent reassurancer, perhaps a reminder of something deeper. The tests were quick, but Alexander couldn't focus on them. His mind was elsewhere, running through every detail, every conversation, every encounter. He kept coming back to Emma's odd behavior, her hesitation, and the way she seemed to shield him from certain truths. Why had she been so secretive about the man Stephen? Why was she acting like she was walking on eggshells around him? After the tests were completed, Alexander was wheeled back to his room. He couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't adding up. There was something lurking just beneath the surface of this so-called life he was being told to accept, and he wasn't going to let it go until he uncovered the truth. As the door to his room closed behind him, Alexander turned to Emma, his resolve hardening. "I need answers, Emma," he said, his voice firm. Emma met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You'll get them," she replied softly. But Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that the answers would be far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The days that followed felt like a blur. Alexander's memory, fractured and incomplete, refused to come back in any meaningful way. Every attempt to piece together the fragments only left him feeling more lost, more disconnected from the world around him. The doctors continued to assure him that it was normal, that time and rest would heal him. But each passing day, he grew more restless, more eager for answers. Emma remained by his side, never leaving for long, always there with a comforting smile, though Alexander noticed the subtle shifts in her demeanor. She would sometimes look at him as if she were waiting for him to say something, as if she were afraid of what he might remember worse, what he might forget. But it wasn't just Emma who made him feel uneasy. The man, Stephen, seemed to be watching him from a distance. Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was off. His smiles felt forced, his gestures too rehearsed, and the way he spoke always cautious, never too familiar, made Alexander feel like he was just another business transaction in a long line of them. One evening after dinner, Emma helped him settle into his hospital bed. She seemed more withdrawn than usual, her movements slower, her words softer. Alexander noticed the change in her but said nothing. Instead, he turned his attention to the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He had never thought of himself as someone who'd be stuck in a hospital room, but here he was, unable to remember the life he'd built, unable to piece together the man he used to be. "Emma," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking." She looked up, her eyes wary. "About what?" "About you. About us," he said, his tone deliberate. "You said we've been through a lot together, but you've never told me how we met. You've never shared anything about our life before all of this." She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the door as if she were considering whether to leave. But then she sighed and sat down beside him. "We met when you were starting your company," she said quietly, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I was working as a waitress. You came into the diner I worked at one day, and we started talking. It wasn't love at first sight, Alex, but we had a connection. We spent hours talking, and before I knew it, we were inseparable." Alexander listened closely, trying to imagine this version of his life. But as she spoke, something felt off, like the pieces weren't fitting together. A billionaire like him, starting his company, meeting a waitress in a diner? It didn't seem to align with the image he had of himself. He'd been raised in a world of wealth and privilege, surrounded by people who'd never known what it was like to struggle. How could he have ended up with someone like Emma? "Why haven't you told me this before?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "It doesn't make sense. If we've been together all this time, why do I feel like I'm still a stranger to you?" Emma's expression faltered for a moment, a shadow crossing her face before she masked it with a smile. "You've been through a lot, Alex. You don't remember, and that's okay. But I've always been here, and I'll always be here." Her words were comforting, but there was a hollowness to them. Alexander couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something wasn't right. The way she seemed to avoid talking about certain aspects of their life together, the way she flinched when he asked about their past, it all pointed to something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Later that night, as Alexander lay in his bed, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. He had learned to listen for the faint sounds of people passing by. The hospital was usually quiet at night, but tonight it seemed different. There was an urgency in the air, a tension that made his skin crawl. He glanced over at the door, half expecting to see Emma, but instead, it was Stephen who appeared. standing in the doorway with a tight smile on his face. His eyes were colder than usual, his posture stiff. "Alex," he said, his voice low, almost too careful. "We need to talk." Alexander sat up, alarm bells ringing in his mind. He hadn't expected to see Stephen alone, especially not at this hour. There was something unsettling about the way the man was standing there, as if he were waiting for Alexander to make the first move. "What do you want?" Alexander asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "I think you're starting to remember things," Stephen said, stepping into the room. "And I think it's time we cleared the air." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. Was Stephen finally going to tell him the truth? Was this the moment he'd been waiting for? He could feel the tension building, every muscle in his body on high alert. "I don't know what you're talking about," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What truth?" Stephen didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "The truth about your accident, about what happened, about the people who've been keeping secrets from you." The room seemed to grow colder as the words hung in the air. Alexander's pulse quickened, and for the first time since waking up, he felt a genuine sense of fear. There were secrets, and Stephen was hinting at something much bigger than a simple amnesia diagnosis. But what was it? And why was Emma acting so strangely? The tension in the room was palpable. Alexander's heart was racing as he stared at Stephen, trying to make sense of what had just been said. The words, "keeping secrets from you," echoed in his mind, spinning like a wheel that wouldn't stop turning. What was Stephen implying? What was he not telling him? For a moment, neither of them spoke. Alexander wanted to demand answers, to ask Stephen what he meant by the cryptic statement. But something about the way the man stood there made him hesitate. The cold, controlled air that surrounded Stephen made Alexander instinctively distrust him even more. Finally, Stephen broke the silence. "I'm not here to make this harder for you, Alex," he said, his tone shifting slightly, but still maintaining that air of careful detachment. "But you need to understand the full picture. You need to know what really happened to you." Alexander's frustration boiled over. "What happened to me? What do you mean? You said I had an accident, but there's something you're not telling me, isn't there? I've been trying to remember, but it's like a fog, and every time I get close to something, it slips away." Stephen's eyes narrowed slightly, and he took a step closer to Alexander, lowering his voice. "It's not just the accident, Alex. It's everything. The people who've been controlling the situation from behind the scenes, the way things are being kept from you, and most importantly, your real connection to Emma." At the mention of Emma's name, Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, my connection to Emma?" he asked, his voice suddenly tight with suspicion. Stephen hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the door, as if he expected someone to walk in at any moment. "I don't want to say too much, but you're not the man you think you are. Neither is Emma." Alexander's pulse quickened. The words didn't make sense, and yet they resonated deep within him, stirring something primal. It felt like a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for days, but every time he thought he had a piece, it vanished before his eyes. "Stop talking in riddles," Alexander demanded, his patience thinning. "Who am I really? And what does Emma have to do with all of this?" Stephen's face was unreadable, but for a split second, something flickered in his eyes, a hint of regret, maybe. Before Alexander could push further, Stephen glanced at the door again, his expression shifting back to its professional, guarded state. "Look," Stephen said, standing up straighter. "There's a lot at play here. You need to trust me, Alex. You're not in danger. Not yet. But there are people who want to make sure you stay in the dark. You're not supposed to remember. You're not supposed to know the truth about your life, about who you really are. And Emma," he paused, his lips pressing together. "Emma's not who you think she is either." Before Alexander could ask more, Stephen turned and walked to the door. He stopped just before exiting, looking back one last time. "Just be careful. The truth isn't always what it seems." And then he was gone, leaving Alexander to wrestle with the tangled mess of thoughts in his mind. The weight of his words lingered like a thick fog. The truth wasn't always what it seemed. What did that mean? Who was he really? His head was spinning. Every conversation he'd had, every interaction, suddenly seemed to carry more weight. What if everything he'd been told was a lie? What if Emma wasn't really his wife? What if everything he thought he knew about his life was part of some elaborate deception? Emma. The thought of her filled him with a mix of confusion and unease. Was she hiding something from him? He couldn't deny the suspicion that had been gnawing at him. Her guarded behavior, her reluctance to talk about their past, the way she flinched when he asked certain questions, it all pointed to something deeper. But what was it? And why was she so determined to keep him in the dark? As the hours passed, Alexander lay in his bed, unable to sleep. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on him. The questions were mounting, and he had no answers. He needed to know the truth. He had to. At some point during the night, he got out of bed, his body still weak, but driven by an overwhelming need for clarity. He moved silently through the darkened hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He reached the door to Emma's room and hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the knob. What if he was wrong? What if he was jumping to conclusions? But his instincts told him otherwise. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was hiding something from him. And tonight, he was going to find out what. With a deep breath, he turned the knob and stepped into the room. The room was dimly lit, with only the faint glow from the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Emma was sitting at the edge of the bed, her head down, lost in thought. She didn't hear Alexander enter, and for a moment he stood frozen in the doorway, watching her. Her posture was slumped, and there was an air of weariness about her that didn't match the woman he had expected to see. The vibrant, confident woman who had claimed to be his wife now appeared fragile, almost vulnerable. Alexander's breath caught in his throat, but he steadied himself and walked into the room, closing the door softly behind him. He had to know the truth, whatever it was. This wasn't just about his lost memory anymore. It was about the lies, the secrets, the things that didn't add up. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice breaking the stillness of the room. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. "Alex, what are you doing up? You should be resting." "I couldn't sleep," he replied, his gaze fixed on her. "I've been thinking, and I need to know the truth." Her face fell, and Alexander saw the tension in her shoulders. "What truth?" "The truth about us," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I don't know who I am, Emma, but I do know that something isn't right. You're hiding something from me, and I need to understand why. What happened to me? Why is everything so different? Why do I feel like a stranger in my own life?" Emma took a deep breath and stood up, walking toward him slowly. Her movements were deliberate, and for the first time she didn't seem so sure of herself. "Alex," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm not hiding anything from you. I just don't know how to explain this. I don't know how to make you understand." "I don't want your explanations anymore," Alexander interrupted, his frustration building. "I want the truth. Who are we, really? What happened in that accident? And what's Stephen hiding from me?" Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked as though she might break. She seemed to shrink under his questioning, her eyes avoiding his. "Please, Alex," she whispered. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" he demanded. "Why did Stephen say you weren't who I think you are? What does he mean by that?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Alexander thought she might collapse. She steadied herself, gripping the edge of the nightstand to support her. "It's all tangled up, Alex. All of it. The truth, the lies, the memories, they're all mixed together. I don't know where to start, but I'll tell you everything." Alexander stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Start with the accident. Start with what really happened to me." Emma closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "The accident wasn't an accident, Alex," she said, her voice trembling. "It was planned. It was meant to happen." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't want it to happen, Alex," Emma continued, her eyes searching his face. "But I couldn't stop it. The people who were behind it, they've been controlling everything. Your accident, your memory loss, your life. It was all part of the plan. The plan to make you forget who you are, to keep you from remembering what happened. Alexander's mind spun, trying to process the flood of information. Why? Why would anyone want to do that to me? And why didn't you tell me? Emma wiped her eyes, her voice breaking. Because I couldn't, Alex. They told me not to. They said if I told you the truth, you'd be in danger. I thought you were better off without knowing. But now, I see the way you're looking at me. I see that you're starting to remember things, and I'm scared. I'm so scared, Alex. Alexander took a step back, the weight of her words crushing him. He had been living in a world of uncertainty, clinging to the hope that his memory would return, that the pieces would fall into place. But now, everything was shattering. The woman who had claimed to be his wife, his rock, his connection to the life he couldn't remember, was hiding something far darker than he had ever imagined. Who did this to me? He asked, his voice cold with a growing sense of dread. Emma hesitated, as though weighing the consequences of her answer. I can't say their names, she whispered, but they're powerful. They've been controlling your life for years. And I was caught in the middle. I never wanted to hurt you, Alex. I never wanted any of this. Alexander felt a rush of emotions, anger, confusion, betrayal. But most of all, he felt a deep sense of loss. Everything he had known, everything he thought was true, had been ripped away from him. The truth he had been searching for had never been simple, and now it was more twisted than he could have ever imagined. Then who am I really, Emma? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Who am I supposed to be? She shook her head, her hands trembling. You're the one who can change everything, Alex. You're the key, but you can't do it alone. The silence between them grew heavy, and Alexander's mind was a whirlwind of questions. The pieces of his life that had once seemed like a jumbled puzzle now felt like shards of broken glass, scattered and sharp. Emma's confession about the accident being planned, about the people controlling his life, left him feeling both exposed and trapped. He couldn't process everything all at once, but the urgency in Emma's voice had ignited something deep within him. So, what now? He asked, his voice steadier than he felt. What do I do with all of this? If everything is a lie, if I've been controlled, how do I take my life back? Emma met his gaze, her eyes full of fear, but also determination. You need to remember who you really are. You need to fight against the people who've been manipulating you, who've been using you as a pawn in their game. But to do that, you have to uncover the truth. You have to trust your instincts, Alex. Trust his instincts. Those words lingered in his mind. Alexander had always trusted his instincts, had always been able to sense when something wasn't right. But now, everything seemed wrong. How could he trust what he felt when the world around him had been turned upside down? Emma, he said, his voice quieter now, why are you helping me? Why did you stay all this time if you knew what was going on? Emma's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked like the woman he had wanted to remember, the woman who had claimed to be his wife. Because I love you, Alex, she whispered. And I've always wanted to protect you, but I've been trapped too. I thought that if I stayed close to you, maybe I could keep you safe from the truth. But now I see that you need to know everything. I can't keep lying to you. Her words struck him harder than he expected. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, Alexander felt a flicker of something familiar, a connection, a longing. But it was quickly overshadowed by the growing suspicion that everything around him had been constructed by people who wanted to control him. Love? Alexander repeated, his mind swirling. How can I trust that? How do I know what's real anymore? Emma took a step closer, her voice pleading. You have to trust me, Alex. I swear everything I've done because I thought it was the only way to protect you. But I can't keep you in the dark forever. You deserve the truth. Alexander looked at her, his gaze searching for any sign of deceit, but all he saw was fear and desperation. For a moment, he wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that she had been trapped in some web of lies too, but doubt crept in like a shadow. What if she was part of the plan? What if she was just another piece of the puzzle, designed to keep him compliant, to keep him from discovering the truth? I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Emma, he said, his voice cold. How can I? How can I believe anything you say when everything I thought I knew has been taken from me? Emma's face crumpled with emotion, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stood there, silent, waiting for him to find the answers on his own. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of the secrets that had been buried deep for so long. Alexander turned away, pacing back and forth, trying to make sense of it all. His thoughts were scattered, each one leading him down a different path, none of them offering the clarity he so desperately sought. He needed more information. He needed more than just Emma's cryptic confessions and Stephen's warnings. He needed answers that could bring him back to himself, to the man he was before the accident. I need to find out who did this to me, Alexander said, his voice low but determined. I need to know who's been controlling my life, who's been pulling the strings. Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and regret. Alex, don't. If you go looking for the truth, they'll come after you. You're not safe. None of us are. I don't care, he replied, turning to face her. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine. I need to remember who I am. I need to take back control of my life. Emma's face softened, and for a moment, Alexander saw a flicker of the woman he had once known, the woman who had been by his side, the woman who had claimed to love him. I know, Alex. I know you want the truth. But please be careful. The people behind this, they don't just control your past. They control your future, too. As Emma spoke, Alexander's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories, words, and half-forgotten moments. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. He couldn't stop now. The road ahead would be dangerous, but it was the only way forward, the only way to reclaim his life and the truth. I'm going to find out everything, Emma, Alexander said, his voice filled with a steely resolve. And nothing, not even you, can stop me. Emma's face fell, and for the first time, Alexander saw something different in her eyes, a mix of fear and something else, something darker. Then you're making a mistake, she whispered, a big mistake. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence, broken only by the occasional interaction with Emma and the enigmatic presence of Stephen. Despite Emma's warnings, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. The more he tried to piece together his past, the more the pieces slipped away, as if the truth was being deliberately hidden from him. Every lead he tried to follow seemed to hit a dead end, and every question he asked only led to more confusion. Emma had become increasingly distant, her usual warmth replaced by a quiet anxiety that she couldn't conceal. She no longer met his gaze for long, and when she did, there was something in her eyes that seemed like a warning. Alexander knew she was trying to protect him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her efforts were more about keeping him from the truth than saving him from danger. One evening, after Emma had left to run errands, Alexander decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The truth, whatever it was out there, and he was going to find it, even if it meant digging through the darkest corners of his past. He slipped out of his hospital room and moved quietly through the halls, his mind set on one goal: uncovering the truth about his accident, his life, and the people who had been controlling him. He had no idea where to start, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't trust anyone who had been a part of his life before the accident, not even Emma. His first stop was the hospital records office. The staff was busy, so he easily slipped past the front desk unnoticed. He found a computer in the back corner and began searching for his file. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he hesitated, unsure of what he might find, but there was no turning back now. He typed in his name, and within seconds, his medical records appeared on the screen. At first, everything seemed routine: the details of his injuries, the treatment he had received, the progress he had made. But then, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The word discharge appeared, followed by a list of names. One name stood out to him: Dr. Nathaniel Vance. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Vance. That name was familiar, but why? He quickly clicked on the file, hoping to find more information. As the file opened, His eyes scanned the text, but it was the last line that caught his attention. Patient's memory loss has been influenced by external factors. Recommend further monitoring. External factors. His mind raced. What did that mean? Had someone been tampering with his memory? The thought made his blood run cold. Someone had deliberately tried to erase parts of his life, to control what he remembered and what he forgot. He needed to find out more about Dr. Vance. He wasn't sure why, but something told him that the key to understanding everything was connected to this man. If he could track down Dr. Vance, maybe he could finally get the answers he had been searching for. Just as Alexander was about to print the file, he heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through him, and he quickly closed the file, turning off the computer. He glanced around the room, looking for an exit, but the door to the records office was already opening. "Mr. Stone," a voice said from behind him. Alexander's heart stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with the cold gaze of Stephen. The man was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "I thought I might find you here," Stephen continued, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "You've been asking too many questions, Alex. It's time you stop digging." Alexander's pulse quickened. "What do you want, Stephen?" Stephen stepped into the room, his presence suffocating. "I'm here to make sure you don't make things worse," he said, his tone low and menacing. "The truth isn't something you're ready to hear, Alex. You're already too deep in this to back out now." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I'm not going to stop until I find out who did this to me, Stephen. Who's been controlling my life, who's been manipulating my memories. And if you're involved, you're going to pay for it." Stephen's smile faded, and for a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You really think you can handle the truth? You think you can take down the people behind all of this? You don't even know what you're up against, Alex." "I'll find out," Alexander said, his voice steady. "And when I do, I'll make sure everyone who's been lying to me pays." Stephen's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're already too late, Alex. The truth is right in front of you. But once you see it, there's no going back. Are you ready for that?" Before Alexander could respond, Stephen turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The weight of his words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer to the truth than ever before. But at what cost? As he made his way back to his room, Alexander's thoughts raced. What had Stephen meant? What was he trying to warn him about? And who exactly was behind all of this? The answers were out there, but they were slipping further and further away. And as much as Alexander wanted to take control of his life again, he realized that he might be playing a dangerous game, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to win. The next day, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around him were closing in. Stephen's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a warning, a challenge, and a threat all rolled into one. He wasn't ready for the truth. Was anyone ever truly ready for the truth? His instincts screamed at him to keep going, to push further, but a part of him somewhere deep down wondered if he was getting too close to something he wouldn't be able to escape. But there was no turning back now. He had already taken the first step, and he wasn't about to stop. That evening, after Emma had gone out to meet a friend, as she had told him, Alexander decided it was time to confront Dr. Nathaniel Vance. If anyone had the answers he needed, it was the man whose name had appeared in his medical records. It wasn't easy to find Dr. Vance's office. The hospital's hallways seemed endless, twisting and turning, but eventually he found the door he was looking for. It was marked with a simple plaque that read, "Dr. Nathaniel Vance, Chief Neurologist." Alexander hesitated for a moment, gathering his courage, then knocked on the door. A voice called from within, "Come in." He opened the door and stepped inside. Dr. Vance was seated behind a large desk, flipping through a file. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with something else, perhaps curiosity, perhaps caution. "What brings you here?" "I need answers, Dr. Vance," Alexander replied, his voice steady but firm. "You were the one who wrote the recommendation about my memory loss. What does external factors mean? What happened to me? Why don't I remember anything? Dr. Vance's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't move. I see you've been looking through your records, he said. That wasn't supposed to happen. I don't care about the records. I care about the truth, Alexander said, stepping forward. What is going on? Who's been controlling my life? Who's been controlling my memories? There was a long pause as Dr. Vance seemed to weigh his options. Then finally he sighed, setting the file down on his desk. External factors, he repeated, his voice low. That's a term we use for, well, let's say, influences that are beyond normal medical intervention. People can't just forget their entire past without reason. But in your case, Alex, it wasn't just about amnesia. It was about erasure. Erasure? Alexander's mind reeled. Who would do that to me? Why? It's complicated, Dr. Vance said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. You were part of a larger plan, a plan orchestrated by people who saw you as a means to an end. Your accident wasn't an accident. It was part of a bigger game. The people behind it knew that if they wiped your memory, they could control your future. Who are these people? Alexander demanded, frustration and anger building inside him. What do they want from me? They want power, Alex, Dr. Vance replied quietly, his gaze flickering to the door, as if to make sure no one was listening. And you're the key to their success. They've been watching you for years, manipulating you from the shadows. They made sure you were positioned just right in the business world. They made sure you had everything you needed to succeed. But now, with your memory gone, they can take control. Alexander felt a sickening realization settle in his stomach. So all of this, all of it, my life, my business, my success, it was all a setup, a manipulation? Dr. Vance didn't respond immediately, but the look in his eyes said everything. The confirmation hung between them like a heavy weight. I didn't choose this life for you, Alex, Dr. Vance said finally. I was just a part of the machine. But I'll tell you this, if you want to break free, if you want to take control of your life again, you have to expose them. You have to confront the people who've been pulling the strings. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been working toward. The answers, the truth, the path forward, all of it was here, laid bare in front of him. But the weight of it felt suffocating. How could he possibly take on the people responsible for this? How could he confront those who had been watching him for so long, shaping his every move? You're stronger than you think, Alex, Dr. Vance said, as though reading his thoughts. You've always had the strength to fight, but the key is not just remembering your past. It's understanding that your future is in your hands. Then how do I find them? Alexander asked, determination seeping into his voice. How do I expose the people behind this? Dr. Vance stood, walking around the desk to stand in front of Alexander. There are people who know, people who have been working to bring them down from the inside. If you want to take control of your life again, you need to find them. They'll help you. But be careful, Alex. There are more eyes on you than you realize. Trust no one. As Alexander left Dr. Vance's office, the weight of his new knowledge settled over him like a dark cloud. The road ahead was treacherous, filled with danger and uncertainty. But one thing was clear. The truth was out there, and he was going to find it no matter the cost. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to show your support. It truly helps me bring more impactful stories to you. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more emotional, thought-provoking tales. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and share what part of the story touched you most, or how it made you feel. Your feedback means the world and shapes the future of the channel. Thank you for being part of this community.